On August 9th, 1965, a man went on television and cried. His name was Kuan Yew. He was the prime minister of a country that very morning, had been thrown out of Malaysia and forced into an independence it did not want. He called it a moment of anguish. The place he now led had no army, no natural resources, no fresh water of its own, no farmland, an unemployment rate around 14%, and a population where roughly 70% lived in slums and half were illiterate. Its GDP per capita was about $500, the same as Mexico, the same as South Africa. Lee himself had once called the idea of an independent Singapore a political, economic, and geographical absurdity. The British had ruled this island for 144 years. When Singapore became independent, Britain's citizens were vastly, almost incomparably richer than Singapore's. Today, that has completely reversed. By most measures, the average Singaporean is now roughly twice as wealthy as the average Briton. The colony overtook the empire, and it didn't take a century. It took barely 25 years. How does that happen? How does a resourceless island with no hinterland and no advantages overtake the nation that colonized it within a single human lifetime? That's what this video is about. And the answer is not luck. It's a series of deliberate, often ruthless, choices. Let's establish exactly how dramatic this reversal is, because the scale matters. In 1965, Singapore's GDP per capita was roughly $500. The United Kingdom's was many times higher. Britain was a wealthy, industrialized, former imperial power, and Singapore was a struggling tropical port. By 1990, just 25 years later, and the year Lee Kuan Yew stepped down as prime minister, Singapore's GDP per capita, adjusted for purchasing power, had already surpassed the United Kingdom's by nearly $7,000. Read that again. Within one generation, the former colony hadn't just caught up to its colonizer, it had passed it. And then, it kept going. Today, the gap is a chasm. Singapore's GDP per capita, adjusted for purchasing power, is around $150,000, ranking second in the entire world. The United Kingdom's is around $60,000, ranking 32nd. On a purchasing power basis, Singapore is roughly twice as rich per person as its former colonial master. The supporting numbers tell the same story. Singapore consistently runs government budget surpluses. Over the past 35 years, it recorded a fiscal deficit in only 2 of them. The UK ran deficits in 32 of those same years. Singapore's average annual inflation over recent decades has been lower. Its unemployment is lower. Its infant mortality is less than half of Britain's. On the Heritage Foundation's Index of Economic Freedom, Singapore ranks first in the world. The UK ranks 39th. This is not a story about a small country doing well for its size. This is one of the most complete economic overtakings in modern history. Now, how? Here's the part that makes Lee Kuan Yew's story genuinely remarkable. He didn't have a plan that just happened to work. He looked at a list of catastrophic disadvantages and converted the biggest one into the entire strategy. The conventional wisdom for newly independent post-colonial nations in the 1960s was a policy called import substitution. The logic? You've just escaped a colonizer who used you as a captive market, so you build domestic industries behind protective tariffs, sell to your own people, and reduce dependence on the outside world. It was the standard playbook. Most newly independent countries followed it. Most of them stagnated. Lee did the opposite. He looked at Singapore and reasoned, we have no domestic market worth anything. There are only 2 million people on this island, and they're poor. Protecting industries to sell to them is pointless. Our only real assets are our location on one of the world's busiest shipping routes, and our people. So instead of hiding from the global economy, we will throw ourselves into it completely. This was export-oriented industrialization, paired with something even more heretical at the time: aggressively courting foreign multinational corporations. In the 1960s, inviting Western multinationals into a freshly decolonized nation was seen by many as inviting the colonizer back through the front door. Lee didn't care about the symbolism. He cared about jobs and capital and technology transfer. He wanted American, European, and Japanese companies to build factories in Singapore, and he was going to make Singapore the single most attractive place on earth for them to do it. To execute this, in 1961, even before full independence, Singapore created the Economic Development Board, the EDB, with a wide mandate and $100 million in capital, an enormous sum for a tiny state. A UN economic mission led by a Dutch economist, Albert Winsemius, had advised that Singapore needed to industrialize fast and create 200,000 jobs in a decade. The EDB became the machine for doing exactly that, a one-stop agency whose entire job was to convince global companies to invest and then remove every obstacle in their way. It worked almost immediately. From 1965 to 1973, Singapore's economy grew at an average of 12.7% per year, not over one good year, for 8 straight years. High growth for 8 years is a start. Sustaining it for 60 is something else. Several deliberate pillars made it durable. Pillar 1. Incorruptible, high-quality governance. Lee Kuan Yew was obsessed with eliminating corruption, not as a moral position alone, but as an economic strategy. A foreign company deciding where to build $1 billion plant needs to know the rules won't change arbitrarily, that contracts will be honored, that bureaucrats won't demand bribes. Singapore built one of the cleanest, most efficient, most predictable governments in the world, and paid its civil servants and ministers salaries competitive with the private sector, specifically so that talented people would serve and would not be tempted to steal. Predictability became a product Singapore sold to global capital. Pillar 2. Relentless investment in human capital. With no natural resources, Lee said openly that Singapore's only resource was its people. So the country poured money into education, technical training, and English language instruction, the last of which was crucial because it made Singapore's workforce instantly interoperable with global business and the language of the multinationals it was courting. The labor force was systematically upgraded over decades, deliberately moving the economy from low-cost assembly to higher-value electronics, to petrochemicals, and eventually to finance and biotech. Pillar 3. The Housing Revolution. This one is underrated. The Housing and Development Board took an island where 70% of people lived in slums and, over a few decades, built high-quality public housing that today houses around 80% of Singaporeans, most of whom own their flats. This did something economically profound. It gave the population a direct financial stake in the country's stability and success, converting a slum-dwelling population into property-owning stakeholders in a single generation. Social stability became an economic asset. Pillar 4. A financial hub built on purpose. Singapore inherited a strong trading position from its days as a British Empire port. Lee deliberately built on top of it, executing a two-pronged financial strategy: become a global financial center in its own right, and use that financial sector to support the manufacturing and shipping industries already growing on the island. Over time, this turned Singapore into a peer of London, New York, and Zurich, competing directly, in some areas, with the very financial capital of its former colonizer. None of these were accidents. Each was a chosen, sequenced, government-driven decision. Now, I'm not going to give you a fairy tale. Singapore's transformation came with a genuine and ongoing trade-off, and honest storytelling requires naming it. The same Kuan Yew who delivered the economic miracle also led in a way that was, by Western democratic standards, authoritarian. Political dissent was constrained. Press freedom was limited. Opposition figures faced lawsuits and other pressures. Singapore today is wealthy, but it ranks far lower on political freedom indices than on economic ones. The model was, in essence, a bargain. Extraordinary competence, order, and prosperity in exchange for a more controlled political space than a liberal democracy would accept. People genuinely disagree about this trade-off, and they should. Defenders argue that Singapore's circumstances in 1965, a tiny, multi-ethnic, resourceless island in a hostile neighborhood, required a strong state to survive at all, and that the results speak for themselves. A population lifted from poverty to among the richest on Earth in one lifetime. Critics argue that the same results might have been achievable with more political freedom, and that prosperity doesn't automatically justify the constraints. There's also a real question economists raise about how much of the growth was sheer capital and labor accumulation, working harder and investing more, versus pure efficiency, and whether the model is fully repeatable elsewhere. The honest answer is that Singapore is a real case study, not a morality tale. It demonstrates what disciplined, competent, long-horizon governance can achieve economically. It also demonstrates the political price that particular model charged. Both things are true, and a serious viewer should hold both at once. So why did Singapore not just succeed, but specifically overtake the United Kingdom, a far larger, resource-richer, longer industrialized nation? Part of the answer is starting points and trajectory. Britain in 1965 was already a mature, wealthy economy, growing at the modest rates mature economies grow at, low single digits. Singapore was starting from almost nothing, which meant it could grow explosively for decades through catch-up, importing proven technology, moving workers from low productivity to high productivity work, and compounding at rates a mature economy structurally cannot match. When you compound 8 to 12% against 2 to 3% for 25 years, the lines don't just converge, they cross, and then they diverge in the other direction. But trajectory alone doesn't explain it, because plenty of poor countries had room to catch up and didn't. The deeper reason is that Singapore made a sequence of correct, disciplined choices over 60 years with remarkable consistency, while running persistent budget surpluses, low debt service relative to its reserves, and a relentless focus on remaining attractive to global capital. It treated national economic strategy the way a great company treats long-term strategy: consistent direction, ruthless execution, decade-long patience. There's also a structural irony worth sitting with. Singapore's greatest inherited asset, its position as a global trading port, was given to it by the British Empire, which built it as a strategic node in a global trade network. Singapore took the single most valuable thing colonialism left behind, the trading hub, and then out-executed its former ruler at the very game of global commerce the British had invented. The student didn't just learn the lesson. The student beat the teacher at the teacher's own subject. Let's go back to that man crying on television in August 1965. Kuan Yew was looking at what almost everyone agreed was a hopeless situation. No resources, no market, no water, no army. A poor, divided, illiterate population on a tiny island that even he had called an absurdity. The reasonable prediction was failure. 25 years later, that island had passed its former colonial master in wealth per person. 60 years later, it's roughly twice as rich, ranks first in the world for economic freedom, and competes with London as a global financial center, while the country that once ruled it runs chronic deficits and grapples with stagnant growth. The lesson isn't that any country can copy Singapore. The political trade-offs are real, and the circumstances were specific. The lesson is narrower and harder. That national prosperity is far less about the cards you're dealt, resources, size, history, and far more about the quality, consistency, and time horizon of the decisions you make with them. Singapore had the worst hand in the room in 1965. It just played it better than almost anyone in history. If you found this interesting, subscribe. This is the kind of story we tell here. I'll see you in the next one.